Welcome to the ATP Project. You're with your hosts Matt and Jeff, and today we have Simon Hill from Plant Proof with us. Had to remember the name then. Simon, thanks for coming, mate. Good to have you on board. You are an expert in all things to do with the vegan industry, and you've got a background in plant-based nutrition as well too, which you're doing your masters in at the moment.
Yep, that's
and
right.
we wanted to have you on to the show because Elsa and the guys are a big fan of yours, as are we as well too, because you're starting to really bring a lot of attention and awareness around the vegan market, vegan nutrition, helping to dispel a lot of the myths. It was nice finally meeting you for the first time as well too. You're a big guy, obviously you train, because the perception are as well too is that typically that if you're going to be fit and healthy, that vegans are a great way for health, but in terms of building a good physique and all the rest of it, there's a lot of people out there that think that you can't do it. So, but anyway, rather than these sorts of opinions, I'd love to hear sort of what you're doing in the industry and what's impacting for you.
Yeah, sure. Firstly, thank you for having me, and that was a great introduction. I'm not sure about expert, but certainly doing my best to sort of cut through the science and explain what I've found in my experience around nutrition. And yeah, I'm really humbled to actually be here. I'm a big fan of your podcast. I've been a long time listener, and it's cool just to get up here and see the ATP operation in the flesh. So before we jump in, thank you for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. No, it's great. It's great to have you up here. But you are an expert. I mean, you've been pretty humble because as I said, you're completing your masters in nutrition at the moment, and with a focus obviously on plant-based nutrition as well too. So there wouldn't be too many people that are sort of up there in Australia with you on that.
Yeah, I think probably in Australia, I probably am one of a few that is sort of in this space, but coming from an evidence-based point of view. And to your point earlier, there are certain stigmas associated with being a vegan, and a lot of people think it could be a dietary framework for people who are weak or thin. Perhaps through the 70s and 80s and 90s, a lot of vegans may not have been a picture of health, and
Sure.
And I think part of what I do is kind of break down the science to show people how if you want to do it, my aim's not to tell people to do it, it's to show the science. And if they choose they want to do it, or they want to, go part of the way to becoming more plant-based, that's great. And I just show people the ways to do it in a manner which is actually healthful, nutrients to focus on, and give people the power to, I guess, take control of their nutrition. And for me, I am doing my masters in nutrition now. As you said, I'm actually a physiotherapist. So about 10 years ago, I finished my degree as a physio, and I was working with AFL players in Melbourne. So I was really, at that point in my career, I was very focused on physiology, anatomy, recovery, injury prevention, things like that. But I noticed that a big gap of my knowledge, which I think is shared actually by a lot of doctors as well, was around nutrition. Yeah. And, as a physio, it wasn't necessarily my role to provide nutritional advice, but I sort of felt within the clubs there wasn't a whole lot of direction, and there was a lot of cookie cutter type programming for the players. And yeah, I think that's sort of the time of my life that inspired me to sort of dig deeper into this space and learn a bit more about what we should be eating.
That's really handy. I've been a bit funny because I love all the science and I love all that sort of stuff, but I'm so glad you're here because we can have a proper discussion and ask the questions without feeling as though I'm questioning a religion or being a blasphemer or something like that, because sometimes I try to have these discussions and I feel like I'm offending people, but I just want to get into the nitty-gritty and that sort of stuff. So how did you overcome that? I mean, because if you were questioning everything and doing the science and that, did you have issues with overcoming some of the social aspects of the vegan movement, or the religious aspects?
I think what happens is, and probably one of the biggest things that we should say from the outset, and we'll no doubt cover, is that the word vegan is not synonymous with health. Yeah. And vegan is an ethic. It just happens to be that people who decide not to eat animal products fall under the same umbrella, right? Yeah. But that doesn't mean that all vegans think the same, right? And they come from, different pillars of veganism are more important to different people, and whatever angle they're coming from, I appreciate and respect that completely. Yeah. But my aim was not to come at the science with an agenda. It was to say, okay, if we just put the ethics and sustainability and whatnot aside, look, what should we be eating? Like, I wanted to know for myself.
Yeah.
You know, I wanted to know the true answer.
Yeah.
I thought I had a very, very healthy diet. I still think I did have quite a healthy diet. And I made some changes to my diet, and that sort of led me to this space.
So what were the
I was gonna say that's a
initial
great point.
changes, and what motivated you to make those changes?
So I think coming through, I guess, my sort of early to mid 20s, and I sort of I went from playing a lot of basketball, a lot of sport, to getting to that sort of university stage where I stopped doing a lot of that sport from a time commitment point of view, but I started working out. And that's when I think a lot of the bro science, type of nutritional education sort of crept into my lifestyle. And I followed a diet which I think is considerably better than like a standard American or standard Western diet, which was made up of, things like chicken breast, broccoli, sweet potatoes, some lean meats and fish and stuff. But I had very little diversity in my diet. I was eating the same things every single day. I didn't understand things like we were talking before the show on microbiome. I had no appreciation for the complexity of our body. And I, think I had a very simplistic diet, whilst at that stage I was trying in my own mind with what I knew to do the very best.
So your decision to follow the vegan lifestyle is not so much to do with the humane aspects, if you like. It was more to do with what the nutrients and the food that you thought were best for your body. Is that correct? Or I don't want to assume anything. You tell me.
Great question. So, and I often think about this because 4 or 5 years now down the track, I understand the ethical things a lot more. I understand the sustainability side of things a lot more. And I just think in general I'm more conscious of where my food comes from. And I say that to people who are not vegan. I said, look, just as long as you're conscious of where your food coming from, that's the greatest step that you can make to sort of be in control and just to understand your impact.
That connection, so important.
Yeah, that connection, right? And back then though, my initial change was from health reasons. I started to uncover different science. I was looking at everything from observational epidemiology to randomized controlled trials. I was looking at different macronutrient breakdowns, what sort of macronutrients are focused potentially lead to poorer health outcomes. Where are they mainly in a Western diet? Could I get them elsewhere? And if I did, in that process, was there going to be other nutrients that potentially I need to focus on that may be a little harder to get? So it was certainly a health decision, and I think I was probably the type of guy at university that probably was. I legitimately think there would have been a stage where a vegan activist probably tried to hand me a flyer. I put my head down. So there was no ethical angle for me at the start, and I'm happy to be transparent and that.
So was it something in the animal meats that you're trying to avoid? Like, were you trying to get away from the arachidonic acids or the other bits and fats, or anything in there that was particularly bad for people to be aware of in the animal?
I think as a society we love to focus on like one nutrient, and I do talk about nutrients, but I think we often sort of zoom right in. So we can go through certain individual nutrients, but a lot of the data I was looking at was general patterns of how people were eating, what they would do. If you were removing something, what were you substituting it for? Because it's very hard sometimes to work out, is something bad for you, or is it when they've removed it in a trial, was it the addition of something else? And I was going round and round and round for years looking at all of this science and working out the patterns. I think certainly I was consuming far too much saturated fat, way above like American Heart Association's recommendations of 5 or 6% of energy per day. The Australian dietary guidelines are a bit higher; they're about 10% of energy per day. I was consuming well in excess of that. And I didn't just take their advice, and believe it. I then started looking at the science and looking at different systematic reviews and meta-analyses and understanding why does one study show that saturated fat doesn't affect cholesterol and then the next does, and looking at confounding variables and pulling the science together that way. And it became clear to me that you didn't necessarily need to have a plant-based diet to have the best outcome, but people that generally had patterns of eating more plants and less animal products were doing better from a disease risk point of view, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, various cancers, but also, you know, studies like the
Blue zone.
the blue zone stuff, but also probably the best population to look at within the blue zones is Loma Linda.
Oh, yeah.
And we're talking through this at fast pace, so if you want to stop this, when we can zoom in on something.
Yeah.
But
No, we can circle back.
we'll circle back.
Yeah.
So, like, one of the things that I was also really, really adamant on was, like, how can we separate the genetics from lifestyle? You
Yeah,
know?
right.
And, you know, people, different genetics, maybe they have different microbiome, they're geared to eat different things. And I looked at the science around genetic versus lifestyle, and you know, there's various studies like the Danish twins type studies that come to the conclusions that probably our health fate is probably determined 20% by our genes and 80% by lifestyle.
Yep.
You know, different people have different views of that, and maybe there's a bit of movement in that. But I think the very best population that we can look at, which takes all of this out of the equation, is the blue zone population in Loma Linda.
So tell us a bit more about that, because I'm not
So the
fully up
blue
with
zone
this.
population in Loma Linda, these are mainly white, non-Hispanic Americans.
Yeah.
And blue zones, just for people who don't know what they are, just do you want to give a quick summary on that?
So blue zones originally was described by a guy called Dan Buettner, who identified 5 populations around the world who were showing great longevity, perhaps some of the longest living people in the world.
Yeah, right.
But not just longest living, importantly, health span. So the difference between I guess longevity and health span. Health span is the number of healthy years you live, right?
Quality of life.
Because there's no point living a lot of years unhealthy.
Yep.
You know, so if we're going to look to people to be, I guess, a pinnacle of health and longevity, we need to look at people who are actually avoiding disease and living a high quality of life, enjoying time with family, friends, have a purpose, things like
functional.
that. Yeah, functional, right? Like, so he pulled together these groups, and you know, there's one in Greece, there's Sardinia, there's one I think in Costa Rica, there's the Okinawan population in Japan, which is interesting because their diet's starting to change and their disease profile's changing.
Is that right?
Significantly. And the final group were the Loma Linda population in California. So Loma Linda population is in California and a little bit of Canada, right?
Okay.
And the interesting thing about these people are they are faith-based. So their religion is the Seventh Adventist.
Oh, yeah.
Have you heard of that?
Yeah.
So
sanitarium, I think,
Yeah.
isn't it? Isn't it some of the that they have sanitarium?
I have no
Anyway,
idea.
So the part of this faith and their religion is that for most of them they don't eat meat, right? But also less than 1% smoke or drink alcohol. So you remove these variables which really affect a lot of other epidemiology. The next thing of note is that when we look at science, one of the most frustrating things is that a lot of the science out there looking at vegan populations, they're not healthy vegans. They're vegans from an ethical point of view. So even though they're performing better, it's like, well, hang on, a lot of these people are consuming, you know, processed foods, high in refined sugars. You know, these foods can be acidic, things like that. So the interesting thing about the Loma Linda, though, is that they do have a majority whole food diet. Okay, and then within this group of people, there are vegans, there are vegetarians who there's different types like lacto, ovo, depending if they eat cheese or eggs.
Okay.
And then there's pescatarians. And there is omnivores. Right? So you've got this almost perfect randomized controlled trial of people that are existing who have, you're taking out the smoking and the alcohol. These people are all healthy. They all have a purpose, right? The omnivores, the interesting thing is that the omnivores probably, right, from the data, suggest they only get about 5 or 6% of their total energy from animal products.
Right.
So the interesting thing is that these omnivores are only consuming about 5% of their total energy from meat, from red meat, right? So you've kind of got this population where you can look at the difference between a little bit of consumption of animal products versus a vegetarian versus the vegan population, and they're all sizable amounts. It's not like some of these studies where they have, you know, 10,000 omnivores and they have 60 vegans. Like it's hard sometimes when you're looking at such a small population to get a true average of what's
exactly.
going on. And they've looked at these. They started studying these, I believe, in 1990. So they've been following this group since, and that new studies are being published all the time, right?
Yep.
And they look at everything from BMI, obesity, type 2 diabetes risk, cardiovascular disease, total mortality, and what I will say first and foremost is that compared to the standard American diet, every single one of these groups are doing substantially better.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's just make that clear from the outset.
Yeah.
They're doing substantially better, and it makes sense, right?
Yeah.
They're healthy. They have a purpose. They also have great ways to alleviate stress in their life.
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of these pillars that
Much less variables.
Yeah. So there's much less variables, right? But the interesting thing is the only group that is within the healthy BMI range. Now, BMI can be an inaccurate predictor of body weight, but tends to be more inaccurate the more that you work out and lift weights and things like that.
Yeah.
These guys, importantly, do not exercise in the gym and work out like that. They do low-level exercise all day.
Yeah,
all day,
right.
right?
Yep,
They're
yep,
always moving, but low level.
So there's another one less variable again.
There's one more. Yeah. So anyway, the data has been being released over the years, and it shows that the vegans are the only ones within the healthy BMI category, which is I think 18.5 to 24. And then it's a stepwise increase. So then it goes vegetarians, then it goes pescatarians, then it goes omnivores, right?
Yeah, right.
If you control for body weight, so control for it, so that because that can be a variable, right?
Yeah,
if we're looking at disease like type 2 diabetes, the vegans have a 50% chance lower risk of developing type 2 diabetes, and that's against a very healthy cohort.
Yeah.
So that's pretty significant.
That is
data.
Yeah.
And the overall total mortality is significantly different.
Yeah, right.
Lowest, again, stepwise as you go down with removing meat from your diet. Now, another thing I'll say here is that data is great. We still need more data to come out. I'd like to see data looking at micronutrient status of parts of the populations, which hasn't come out.
Yeah.
But high level, when we look at it and we see that they're living great long lives and they have low disease risk. Yeah. So it's studies like this which initially got me thinking, hang on, my perception of vegans was not that.
Yeah.
And don't get me wrong, the omnivores, like I said in that study, they're doing exceptionally well. So we can learn something from all of them.
Sure, but obviously they're certainly not doing as well as the vegans. So do you think that, I mean, in terms of the conclusion of why the vegans are outperforming in that cohort, why they're outperforming, say, the meat eaters or even the pescatarians who are just eating fish, for those that don't know, then do you think it's because the vegans are consuming more nutrients and cofactors and polyphenols and everything else from their
phytochemicals?
Yes. Do you think that's, or do you think that there's other nutrients inside the meat that's actually causing a negative impact?
That's why I really want to look at micronutrient status and compare the groups, right? Because if we see that the vegan population is lower in some micronutrients, which we can talk about, nutrients of focus, which are important if you're going to remove animal products, and certain studies have definitely identified that vegans need to look at certain nutrients, right? And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that gets a bit of a bad name. It's a way for people to slander a vegan diet. But I think irrespective, whatever diet it is, you need to be looking at something.
Sure.
You know, the vegan diet, yes, the negatives are you need to be more focused on certain nutrients. Standard American diet, you need to be more focused on removing some things.
Exactly.
So like there's different ways of looking at it. But I would say that we need a bit more information to answer your question firstly. But if I was hypothesizing, I would say there are mechanisms to do with things that are in meat. Depending, I'd like to see the breakdown of that meat. Is that energy that they're getting from meat all like red meat, not processed meat, firstly, that has nitrates and things like that in it? Other mechanisms are things like TMAO and those sorts of...
What's TMAO?
Trimethylamine oxide. It's the one that it's when they feed on carnitines and choline and turn it into atherosclerotic plaques or atherogenic plaques.
So there's been
and also the way that Simon, also the way that the animal is also treated for too. I mean, in terms of there's a great film called Food Inc. I don't know if you've seen it, and it talks about animal husbandry in terms of the fear. And when the animal is slaughtered in slaughterhouses, the chemicals that are released inside the animal versus ones that are done in a more humane way, if that makes sense as well too. All these things can have a big
I think
impact
definitely
as well too.
the more science that can come out of this population, the better, to drill down on it. What are the sources of their food, like to your point, and the more we can go back and look at the actual food supply chain, the more we can make.
And the constants too. Like, what if they're all eating the same amount of fruit and vegetables? Because, like a meat eater and a vegan might eat the same amount of fruit and vegetables, but then whether the omnivore might actually be eating the animal protein and the vegan feeling necessary to increase more legumes or something like that. It'd be really nice
but they might not.
Some. Yeah, that's
so
what I'm saying.
If they're consuming less calories, is it, who's the vitamin C? Is it Linus Pauling? I forget who it was that lived quite long. He believed in having a much smaller calories, and he believed that actually improved longevity, is actually eating less calories.
Which lines up with the lower BMI of these vegans, which again is likely because of the calorie density of food, right? And if you're filling up on fibrous food, which is a lower calorie density, day on day, week on week, you're likely to be consuming less calories.
Yes.
Unless you're trying. Like, I know now, if I want to put on size, it's a conscious effort, right? And because I'm eating foods that are less calorie dense, it means think about an animal that only eats plants. They're grazing all day. So you've got to, if you want to shorten that into your standard 3 meals a day, you've got to be prepared to have big feasts.
Well, there's a lot of chewing. There's a lot of calorie burn on the actual digestion and the consumption of a lot of these plant proteins. So, and then the least refined it is. The least refined it is by actually having to process it through your own jaw. So that makes a big difference.
So stepping back from the science a little bit, especially for our listeners who are saying, so how have you found the diet since you've started? I mean, in terms of what are the things that you've noticed most about your health, in terms of how you perform? I mean, as I said before, you're a pretty big guy. You can tell that you train at the gym. So this is an opportunity maybe to dispel some of those myths and also talk about your general health, how it's improved, or because obviously if it hadn't, you wouldn't still be doing it.
No, exactly. So. I mean, health was my priority and still always is, and I'm forever trying to hone in more on the science and waiting for new papers to come out because research does change. It can give us more insight into science and nutrition and how we should be eating. But in terms of my personal experience, I had all of the initial fears that I think any young guy that was experimenting with removing meat who had been training for a few years at the gym would have.
How old were you when you decided to go, that's it, I'm changing?
About 4 or 5 years ago now.
And how old are you now, Si?
32.
32, so
sort of
late 20s.
Mid to late 20s. And I didn't mention, but I had removed all dairy from my diet when I was 18.
Right.
And that was not a research-based decision. That was based on, I was having it, I was feeling lethargic, and I decided, okay, I'll cut it out for a week. I felt way better, and I left it at that. I just removed it, and I kept going about everything else I was doing. So anyway, but sort of fast forwarding back to, I guess, this time when I was changing my diet to a plant-based diet, I had those initial fears. Where am I going to get my protein from? Am I going to lose size? Am I going to get the right nutrients to recover? I had all of these questions, and so I knew that, okay, this is probably a great thing to do for my long-term health, but I don't want to be skinny, weak, and live a long life. I want to be able to continue my performance, with gym, be functional, be able to run, eventually have kids, be able to play with them. Like, there's no point having a decline in your performance. I guess we're speaking without ethics right now.
Sure.
So there's certainly people that would say, well, from an ethical point of view, you could just remove everything and not worry about your own performance. But what I'm getting at is my initial decision. I was very much adamant. I needed to hit this from a performance angle and make sure that my diet was not letting me down.
And you're within your rights to
absolutely.
Want the best out of yourself,
I mean, like Queen, you want it all, right? You want health, you want performance, you want longevity. Why not? So I mean, and the thing is that in terms of, as I said, setting aside any religious or emotional views in terms of animals and all that sort of stuff. I mean, this is a great advocacy, if you like, for this lifestyle. Regardless of that, effectively, you're drilling down to ultimate truth, if that makes sense, as far as you see it.
So I started to drill down and work out, okay, well, how much protein do I need? And okay, let's have a look at the different plant-based sources that are out there. And let's have a look at bioavailability, but let's have a look at about as well, how am I going to manage it? Am I going to enjoy it? How's my gut going to feel? And I pretty much put together a bit of a plan for myself where I could transition over a certain period, sort of 3 or 4 months. And that was mainly built around the fact that based on what I was reading, I wanted my gut to have a chance to actually turn over and have some changes in my bacteria rather than just going from, pretty minimal amounts of fibre to a lot.
This is about 5 years ago.
Yeah.
So I'm dying to know about this. So when you were beforehand, you would have had a certain food pyramid in mind, or a macro split in mind, and you would have had an understanding of calories in and calories out to a certain degree. When you switched to this style of eating, how did that change? Because you would have all of a sudden realising, to get my protein in, I'm screwing around a little bit more with the carbs and the fats. Did you go from like a 40-30-30 or a 60-40, whatever? I'm not going to do maths as I go.
I'd say my protein was, I would probably have now, and this might sound low for some people, I weigh 90 kilos, and I probably average 150, 155 grams a day.
No,
yeah, right.
No, seeing, as I said, and again, for people that aren't watching or that haven't seen your website, you look like you train. I mean, immediately when I saw it, it's like, I can tell obviously you train. So you certainly don't look like you're deficient in protein.
Yeah, so I have about 150, 155 grams of protein per day.
Yeah.
I think I was probably having over 200 before I made the change.
Yeah.
And I think the biggest change, though, was probably from a carbohydrate point of view.
Yep.
I really steered clear of unrefined grains, oats, brown rices, quinoas.
Yeah.
I didn't eat a whole lot of that. And I think subconsciously I stuck to things like sweet potato, and I kind of thought...
Typical bodybuilder type
I kind of
foods.
thought that those grains weren't great for me.
Yeah.
So that was a big change that I made, and definitely upped my overall carbohydrate consumption went up, but it's from unrefined carbohydrates.
Yeah.
It's not from added
Because
sugars.
when you're going for the plant-based proteins, you're getting that little bit extra carbs and that sort of stuff in with it.
Happens.
So the higher energy carbs, such as the cereals and grains, you'd be better off. You were found better off reducing those, increasing your nutrient-dense vegetables and that sort of stuff instead, and that evened it out a bit.
Sorry. So what I meant was, before I changed, I had very little focus on grains. When I did change, I started realizing the health benefits of
the other, right.
And I think my understanding of what my macronutrient sort of ratio needed to be did change. I realized, okay, I can probably tolerate more carbohydrates, providing they're the right type. Right? It's such an umbrella term. It's a demonized term.
No, it's kind of good because it's more realistic than saying that the calories, inverse calories, percentages and numbers aren't real. Because when we're looking at this sort of stuff, your calorie yield from your diet would have changed so much by switching over, because, like you're saying, less nutrient density, but more nutrients, more calories burnt in the process of digestion. For example, we have 20% less calories yielded if it's resistant starches, or the more processed and refined it is, the way you were cooking it, the way you were processing it, totally changes your calorie yield. And then as your microbiome would have been changing, your whole calorie yield would have changed again. So all of a sudden we got the calories in, calories out is important, and you can judge by your physique and your progress what's on the right track, but you can't be too... We wouldn't have had the data to know exactly how to crunch the numbers. You would have had to be a bit more intuitive and a bit more trial and error.
My goal was, let's increase unrefined carbohydrates. Let's be comfortable to drop the protein down a bit, and let's watch what happens. And at the same time, let's go from moderately high saturated fat intake, and let's go and find foods where we get a more polyunsaturated fat intake, right? That was my goal with that. And I didn't lose size. I think in the initial month I probably did drop maybe 1.5 kilos, 2 kilos.
But was that fat or was that muscle?
I actually think a lot of it was like inflammation. Retention that I was like water retention that I was holding.
Urates and that. Did you get much bloods done? Did you see like uric acid levels plummet?
My cholesterol bloods are pretty amazing to look at. But I feel like it was inflammation, and to be honest though, that was when those doubts were still with me, because I didn't just put a line in the sand and say, I'm going plant-based. This was me saying, okay, I'm going to try this, and I want to eat more of that, I want to have less of that, let's see how it goes. I'm reading the studies that I'm reading about protein. Maybe I don't need as much as remembering that I don't want to be a competitive bodybuilder or anything like that. So my goals were realistic, basic sort of performance and functional and whatnot, be healthy, right? So, I lost that little bit of weight at the start, but I changed my volume. I think as well, probably because of the calorie density.
Yep.
I was, and a lot of people do this, if you sort of just go from an animal-based meal to the plant-based meal and you're not eating more, as we've just covered, your overall calories are down.
Yep.
So I was probably just falling into that that sort of scenario of not having enough calories.
Yep.
And with different foods, and I totally understand it, people are sort of made often to fear carbs and whatnot, and I was in the same position. So I was like, am I right to be adding more of these things here? And,
sure.
you know, I over that sort of 3 or 4 month period, I got it to a stage where I was feeling amazing, feeling like my recovery was feeling great, my training volume was going up.
Great.
And that was for me, that was huge, because I was like, hang on, something's happening here.
Yeah.
Something's happening with my body. Not that necessarily anything was wrong with my body, but beforehand, but something was happening that was enabling me to train more consistently.
Yeah.
I'm not going to sit here and say my bench press went up exorbitantly or things like that. I wish it did.
Yeah.
But my recovery, the recovery for my that is hugely different.
Which coincides with talking about before, with the reduction of inflammation and other metabolic acidic waste and that sort of stuff, such as the uric acids that might have been loading up from the meat.
So
I think though, on the uric acid stuff, because there's some interesting science out there that you know, various papers will find that vegans are more acidic or have more inflammation than others find the opposite. And I think it ultimately comes down to the source of your food. If you're eating a really refined
and the population involved, like there's a lot of people out there that might be the style of vegans that might eat gluten shaped into the shape of a chicken drumstick sort of thing, and that would be a vegan source of protein,
meat worshippers.
You know? Well, I only saying that because I was in America last week at Expo West, walking around, and there's a massive trend, of course, with plant protein, everything. But there's a massive trend of things like plant beef jerky, and then plant.
It's an interesting one, isn't it?
It's shaped like animals.
I think probably, again, that transition is some people trying to progress. I mean, it might be a noble thing that they're doing, but still kind of haven't really made that mental break to move away from meat. So it might actually be one of those things.
They were so far away from health foods, but they were claiming to be health foods, but they were so highly refined and processed, they were no longer health
That's one of my biggest challenges, is trying to educate people that in the next 5 years, it's going to be harder and harder to be a healthy vegan, because there's going to be so much more temptation from product innovation, which isn't necessarily being done from a health point of view. And like, to your point, I think a lot of those products make it very easy for transitioning, but ultimately, should they make up the majority of your calories? Probably not.
Or would they make you healthier? Not necessarily.
And there's no research to sort of show people that are consuming those types of foods are healthier than people consuming animal products.
But
I
was going to say, but it sounds like, Simon, you're advocating obviously for, you know, fresh is best, eat local, you know, remove the glyphosates, you know, get rid of the pesticides as well too. Whereas, as you say, a lot of vegan people are like, it's all about the meat. Anything else is fine.
You're exactly right. Like, once you decide that you're going to eat plant-based, you're not finished yet. You just started.
You
need to now concentrate on, again, the source of your foods, with the quality of foods. You need to know where it comes from. Local, much better than something, you know. And this ties into things like sustainability. People like to just tear down meat, but like, if you're buying avocados that have been shipped around the whole world, right? That's not a sustainable process. So that's where I kind of probably not disagree with other vegans, but I tend to try and look at things from a more holistic point of view.
Did that sustainability thing sort of grow as you came into sort of changing and eating, and then actually realise, okay, this is actually having an impact that is actually also good for the planet as well too? Yeah,
certainly. I think my first motivation was from a health point of view. But the more science that I was reading around health, naturally, it was opening my eyes up to sustainability and environmental practices and agriculture and things like that. And like I said, I think the plant-based agriculture has just as much improvement to do, if not more, than the animal agriculture.
We've got to get the eco-biome. We talk a lot about microbiome. We need the eco-biome as well, get this soil and everything under control so we can make
and the
proper
sea. And I noticed that you're passionate about plastic in the sea, which is funny because Matt says when he retires, he says he's going to get on that
fix
that
junket plastic island the size of Texas in the ocean.
Crazy.
Got to get rid of that.
This is obviously something that you're passionate about as well.
Yeah, I think it's hard when you when you sort of come across the statistics and you see what we're doing to our planet, it's hard to sort of turn a blind eye.
Oh, it's just so unnatural.
I think it's easy to assume that governments will enforce policies and companies will make changes, but ultimately changes need to happen really quickly.
Yeah.
And if the scientists, the way I look at it is and we're moving here, I guess, to the ocean and climate change. It's a huge topic.
Sure.
We open a can of worms here. But the way I look at it is if the scientists are right and we do nothing, there's going to be catastrophic changes to our environment.
And it's one of those things, Simon, I think in terms of whether you agree with climate change or not, I don't think you can disagree with the amount of pollutants, plastics. And I mean, I heard the other day, in fact, Tony brought this to me. She said, Jeff, did you know that they did a study on the beers in America? And they were having a look at Miller and, you know, all these other beers. And they went through and there was glyphosate in all of them, even in the organic ones as well, too. And the organic companies were actually saying, look, it's in our water table now. We can't, even though we've got completely organic land, we've never used any of these sorts of, you know, herbicides and pesticides and all the rest of it because they're in the environment. And this is the problem because, again, whether whether, as I said, whether you believe in that or not, we can see the impact. We're starting to experience it with our health. We're damaging the waterways. You can see what's happening, obviously, with regards to the plastic. Is incredible.
There's an area in America, Cancer Alley. Have you heard of that?
No.
So that's like a runoff of the Mississippi River where a lot of the glyphosate ends up. And they have the highest incidences of cancer in America. There's a guy, Zach Bush. Have you heard of him?
Oh, I haven't heard the name.
Zach Bush does a lot of talking about glyphosate and regenerative agriculture. And I think I listened to him not long ago, but he was speculating it could take 50 years to get glyphosate out of the system if everyone stopped today.
Wow. Yeah, because of the other penetration enhancers. And that's the other problem. They did a lot of research on glyphosate by itself and could create a nice story that it's not so bad. But when it's with penetration enhancers that break down the surface tension, get it inside cells and get it into the soil and into the places it normally wouldn't go to, that's when it's 1,000 times worse. I had this thing, I just stir up policymakers. I don't think it's actually possible, but it's kind of this little thing I do where I call it Purple Rain campaign, but I say, if you could make glyphosate purple, I said, let's just see I said, fine to have it, just make it purple. Can we trigger an initiative globally, make it purple? Because like you said, you can't see it, but if you could see the damage it was doing, and I mentioned to some politicians, and they go, no way, you'd never do that. And I said, why? You told me that it gets sprayed and then it's gone. And they're going, oh no, all the waters will be purple, all the rivers will be purple, all our grass will go purple, all our food, when you buy our food, it'll be covered purple. And I said, yeah, well, you told us also we can wash that off. We just rinse it off, we wash it off.
Yeah, so at least you can identify it.
I can see that it's there, I can wash it off, and then I'll eat it. And then what happens, I open it up and I see the purple in the seeds, I see the purple in the fibre, I see the purple everywhere. And I said, people would all of a sudden start to understand where this thing, the impact it's making. And the policymakers, which don't know the science, that it's probably not possible to do it, but they're sitting there going, no way, it'll ruin our industry, it'll ruin agriculture, it would ruin tourism, it would ruin everything else, the Great Barrier Reef, no one would visit that. It was amazing because I'm sitting there going, why? Because we can see it.
Well, and
now that it's clear, we can't see it, you're all cool with that, but you're lying to us saying that we can wash it off.
Exactly.
And then I was thinking, and there it's Oregon, and that's a problem. People don't see it, they don't understand it, they don't relate it back to them. So
I've got a personal question for you. Apparently you're also friendly or been working with Chris Hemsworth as well too. Yeah. Did you talk to him obviously about the vegan lifestyle? I'd imagine.
I get asked a lot.
Is he vegan? I mean, I'm curious from my own.
Chris doesn't have a label on the way that he eats.
Yeah.
Now he's tremendously conscious of where his food comes from.
Yep.
His brother is actually vegan.
Liam?
Yeah.
Yep.
So he's vegan, and I think having someone in the family who just changed the way that they eat, naturally you look at things in a different light. And
there's at least a couple of meals you might eat.
Yeah, and more up to it. And certainly eats plant-based meals. Yeah. I believe leading into a couple of his movies, he's eaten more plant-based. But yeah, in terms high level, he doesn't like to put a label on it. But that's okay. A lot of people don't like to put a label on it. It's particularly if you're someone in the public eye like that. For like when I first started transitioning, for example, I didn't know if it was going to be a lifelong thing. Now, what I often see is like big giant stars come out and talk about it, that they're trying a vegan diet, or maybe they're not even trying a vegan diet, they're just eating a couple of plant-based meals, and then they're seen to not be doing that anymore. And it looks bad on the diet. It looks bad on the person for jumping around. So I think, when you're in the public eye like that, sometimes it's best to keep things private.
Sure. Makes sense. And if you're doing it for health, not for the social or the religious aspects as well, then you might want that freedom to move anyway.
Yeah.
So
which I mean, his brother Liam is more from an ethical point of view. So he's happy to talk about it and put label on it.
Did you work with Liam as well too, or have you?
I haven't worked with Liam, so I've worked with Chris and part of his new fitness program centre, which
I think Tony saw that online. She said that there's a real push in his wife as well too. Yeah,
so his wife Elsa, Chris wanted to put a program together where people could have access to the experts that were giving him advice. So I'd been working with Chris prior to this, giving him advice about nutrition. He's got a bunch of other people in there from a chef nutrition background. He's got a bunch of people in there from a mindfulness, people that have worked with him, meditation, other mindfulness practices, and then a bunch of people in there from a workout, everything from gym workouts to outdoor workouts, things like that. So it
looks like a really nice app, actually.
Yeah, it's great, and it's awesome to be part of the community that are using it, are very inspiring and sort of rallying around each other. So it's been fun so far.
It sounds obviously a lot more holistic than just, it's weights and diet. It's actually sort of, looking at
it's all encompassing. It's got everything from yoga to guided sleep meditation to morning walk, like different walking meditations. That there's, from a dietary point of view, people can eat whatever they want, so it caters for everyone.
So what's the name of the app in case people are interested?
So the name of the app is Centre without an E on the end of it.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Excellent.
So I'm dying to know. This is just me because I'm weird like this. I'm dying to know what you've discovered when you transitioned over, because I see a lot of, I don't know if it's fair. I work with a lot of vegans and that sort of stuff, and I see a pattern. Excuse me, where people are convinced that they're low in protein. That some vegans can't get protein. There's not enough protein, so they feel the need to use a lot of protein supplements. Did you feel the need to consume, in the early days, were you supplementing your plant-based diet with plant-based proteins?
I mean, I still have probably one plant-based protein shake a day, which I think is, I was doing that before with a non-plant-based shake, or even probably a plant-based shake at some stages when I wasn't, just purely because I liked the flavour or whatever it was. But the plant-based proteins have come a long way in terms of flavour. They were pretty hideous at the start.
Chalky at the start.
Very earthy.
So that, because the animal meat being like animal proteins being 10 to 30% proteins, but the plant stuff's like 10 to 20% protein. It's not significantly low. There's a difference in the protein though. The branched chain amino acid levels are much lower. There's some interesting studies coming out now where they do some really high intensity training using rice proteins compared to whey. Negligible changes.
A
lot of interesting data about the whey proteins compared to like an if it fits your macro style, just eating protein. Not a huge amount of difference. So I'm not sure how relevant the deficient branched chain amino acids in the plant proteins, whether that's needed. But is it something that you look for? Do you go and supplement your plant-based diet with extra branched chains or anything?
Yeah, so I guess high level. So from a food point of view, firstly, my emphasis is on a varied diet. So I'm not just like mono eating or raw vegan diet, which we can jump into, which certain people that suits and whatnot. But I think from a gaining size point of view, it can make it harder. So in terms of my amino acids, I'm just making sure that I'm getting a varied mix of legumes, nuts, seed, grains, not sticking to the same ones every day, not sticking to the same ones for breakfast, lunch and dinner, which makes it more enjoyable anyway. And naturally when you do that, you get a much better mix of amino acids.
Right.
In saying that, there are times where I've used your vegan aminos. I mainly use aminos if I'm trying to lose weight and potentially my protein intake might come down a bit, and I find it really useful to make sure that I'm still getting those major essential amino acids, which I think, again, even people who are not vegan are taking those aminos as well.
Yeah.
So it sort of just comes down to what your goal is and where your overall diet is. But yeah, going back to your question, I get more than enough protein every day, and where possible I try and get it from food.
So
do you
oh, sorry,
yeah, I was going to say, do you actually look at the food sources that you're getting? Because I mean, I appreciate one of the criticisms or the concerns that people have over a plant-based diet is trying to get all the 8 essential amino acids in one source. I mean, obviously you can get it with non-vegan sources, but are you conscious of that and go, right, I'm getting this amino acid group from here and this one from here, and you try and incorporate that, or you just allow it to work itself out?
I think the whole complete protein thing was something that was it was sort of glorified a bit a couple of decades ago. And whilst it's still relevant, there's been numerous things that have come out which showing that you don't really need to be focusing on each single meal and making sure you're getting 100% of all of the essential amino acids. If you're eating that varied diet across the day, you will naturally get all that you need. And if we look at the major sort of American Dietetics and Nutrition Association, they come out and they've said that, and they talk about vegan diets being healthful and supplying all of the major macronutrients that people need.
Yeah, right.
At any life stage, that is as well.
Yeah. And there's a lot of, outside of the plant industry, there's a lot of data on collagens and stuff like that showing similar, that the protein score that was pretty much set up by the whey industry to promote whey as great and everything else as rubbish, has starting to show a few holes, that sort of stuff, where that whole branch chain amino acid is not just driving everything. In my experience too, treating a lot of people on plant-based diets, and funny, I used to do a lot of work with animals, so I used to do a lot of treatment with horses and dogs and cats, and it's just something I did because I like animals. But I noticed some really interesting trends there with herbivore mammals and that sort of stuff in the need for insects. And what I discovered there is there was a lot of issues with arthritis in horses and a lot of that sort of stuff if they were taken away from the pasture. So if they were stopped eating the pasture and put into a stables, their food was, compared to, it's more refined. It was lifted up off the ground. They weren't getting as many insects, and they got a lot of arthritis and a lot of issues like that. We put them back out into the pasture to spell. They'd specifically go out and seek out insects and everything. Now, with this new work that we're doing with the collagens and that sort of stuff as well, and you see there's a lot of movement with collagen being able to heal these things, it's all based on measuring the hydroxyproline incorporation into the bone, or the hydroxyproline incorporation into fascia. With our body being 30% of the protein in our body's collagen. Muscle, for example, 6 to 10% of the muscle mass is collagen, but 30% of its power comes from collagen. I was looking into that plant-based diet. There's no hydroxyproline at all found within those plants. So there's the hydroxylation of the protein, the proline, by vitamin C to make it. So what I noticed though in the animal world, we used to supplement those kind of insect stuff. So we used to supplement the chitin from the exoskeleton because that's what builds the disc spaces and the cartilage, and we used to supplement through the other hydroxyproline parts out of the collagen aspects of the insects, and that would prevent their arthritis for animals that were living in stables and that sort of stuff. I've always wondered, in the vegan community, I know on the average person, forget vegan community, the average person that eats like vegetables eating about 0.5 kilo of insects a year, that's found in their vegetables. But if we're going more highly refined and more processed and eating less stuff the way nature intended, we're missing out on all that. Have you heard of anything within the vegan community talking about where would insects sit? I was just curious. I mean, there's a long way around to get to a weird question.
It's a very interesting area. I was deeply engrossed by what you were saying there, but I think hygiene as we're getting more hygienic, it's insects, but also lack of soil on plants is important as well, and that affects
the microbes,
microbiome, and
you found that big in the States, eh? A lot of people interested in dirt.
Yeah, actually, because a lot of people thought I was saying when I was saying modbiotic for our gut, right, they thought I was saying mudbiotic, and there's a lot of movement in America talking about the ecobiome and rebuilding the dirt so we can make nutrients in plants properly. But that's the same as our gut. Our gut, the microbiome makes a lot of our nutrients, So
but going back to your point, where do insects sit?
Yeah,
and I guess I'll speak to some various opinions of different people that I know who
Yep.
may be coming from
cool.
different angle with veganism. But I mean, the general gist is that with veganism is, if you, from an ethical point of view, is to do as least amount of harm as possible. So
Yep.
usually the fact that insects are killed during crop farming and agriculture is seen as less damaging than supporting factory farming. You know, that'd be the general opinion.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And because I know...
And keeping in mind that, you know, during factory farming, there, you know, a lot of insects are also killed.
Yeah.
Because, you know, there's...
pesticides.
And habitats destroyed. And
Like I go
pesticides.
organic broccoli, and we don't bother because we just eat them. But you sort through and find all the little cobwebs and cocoons and all that sort of stuff that's in your organic broccoli that's not found in the other stuff that's all sprayed. But that's a big part of the diet, because if you're not getting adequate hydroxyproline and the chitin substances, you've got to make that out. You're going to deplete your vitamin C, you're going to deplete your proline to make that elsewhere. It's really interesting, because it's just when we were doing a lot of work with the manufacturers of collagen, and I noticed that a lot of their data relating to measurements, its ability to heal the gut wall or the ability to bone, it was all about hydroxyproline incorporation into the bone. That's why we made a hydroxyproline out of vegan stuff, because I wasn't going to make
So how did you make it?
We hydroxylated proline and vitamin C, basically. So we ran through the same process, so it's not depleting the vitamin C and the proline from our status, so it can go in. And then we have a glucosamine made out of a corn sugars and through a similar fermentation process, not similar, a different fermentation process to make glucosamine out of glucose. But those things there is the only way I could really think of correcting those sort of like conditional deficiencies, because we're not out eating in nature anymore, like to try to compensate for the lack of for the over processing of our foods. And I think it's really important, because if we don't have adequate levels of chitins and hydroxyprolines, these connective tissue support, then you actually could be depleting other sections of your body. And I used to notice there was a lot of trends in with the bad teeth and the bad gums, bone deficiencies, and again, linking back to the fear of losing muscle mass and that sort of stuff, supporting connective tissue and fascia and ligaments and tendons, I thought would be important. But you're a physio and you're a vegan, so I figured you'd be the man to ask. Like, what is there any...
Well, I mean, I'd probably need to look a little bit more into hydroxyproline, but you can certainly get proline in your diet.
Yeah, exactly.
And you
get the vitamin C. So that's where at the moment, without the hydroxyproline directly, that's where the other mammals that people might be eating are getting their proline from, hydroxyproline from. So but I just figured there was just one thing there when I was looking at all the data and all these health benefits, people talking about the bone broths and all those sort of stuff. I was just wondering what is in there that's not in anything else.
It'll be interesting to see, because I can't speak to any data that suggests that vegans have
hydroxyproline deficiencies.
Joints.
Yeah, I was just about to say.
So if we look high level, I haven't been able to identify that that's something in a population that exists.
Yeah, good.
Which, I mean, there's a multitude of factors there. Lower BMI may be helping them as well. But
and less inflammation and less degradation.
So I think there's a...
It's interesting. I was just curious to see if there was anything, because of your history with the physio and then the movement over to the plant, I was just curious if there was anything there regarding to collagen or connective tissue.
It's not something that I've looked at, but, you know, I try and take a holistic approach to everything. So like I said, there's new science coming out all the time, and no diet's bulletproof.
No.
There's always going to be whatever diet you're doing where you need to look at nutrients of focus, and as new science comes out, what can you do? What's the best option for you within your dietary framework? And you know, perhaps that may be one of them. But
I was just curious.
I guess we'll see. You know, in the next few decades, I think we'll get so much better data as we get data from people who are actually plant-based and not just vegan. So it'll be interesting to see.
What are the typical things that you'd move towards as far as looking after collagen or that sort of stuff? Is there anything particular that you recommend, or that maybe women come and talk to you as well too, or is that not a question that you would normally get, Simon?
I mean, it's an interesting one. I guess collagen, when you ingest it...
Oh, no, I'm even talking about your own production of collagen. Is there sorts of foods that you recommend?
The important things are obviously making sure you're getting enough vitamin C, and you're getting enough of those amino acids and proteins in your diet.
Yeah.
there can be, along with the other nutrients of focus, which I think people need to look at in their vegan diet, which are, pretty well documented. B12 is something that everyone that is not having animal products needs to supplement.
Yeah.
There are fortified foods, but the science hasn't shown reliability in terms of a fortified foods preventing a deficiency or reversing it.
Yeah.
So you'd be playing with fire there until science comes out. And then vitamin D.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because non-vegans are also having an issue with vitamin D around the world. But vitamin D is very important from a bone mineral density point of view. A lot of people think calcium in the vegan diet is going to be hard without dairy, but we don't absorb a lot of calcium out of dairy anyway.
Yeah.
So I sort of tell people to really focus on calcium-rich foods, but make sure your vitamin D is not deficient is going to be pretty important. And ideally, getting extra sun if you can.
Within moderation. Well, we talk about that a lot, and that this hysteria over exposure to the sun has gone too far. I mean, definitely we know that overexposure can lead to skin damage and cancer, but I get more worried about the average sunscreen that people put on, which is full of long chain hydroxycarbons, which store in the breast tissue of women and men. But at the same time, you're not getting the vitamin D that you need. A small amount of exposure in the early morning and late afternoon is actually a really good thing for you. So
vitamin D deficiency is something that everyone talks about, but sunlight's the way to do that. B12 is the other one everyone talks about.
B12. So like if we look at various studies that look at vegetarians and vegans and look at their nutrient levels, their status, those two, calcium is more from a point of view, I think, that people look at the diet and say there's not going to be enough in there.
Industry,
but there's plenty of calcium, isn't there? There calcium?
Focus on your dark leafy greens.
Leafy greens.
Selenium, have Brazil nuts. 1 or 2 Brazil nuts every day.
Exactly.
Zinc. The thing is, a lot of this is very easy if you understand these nutrients to focus on. The reason why it can potentially be an issue is that absorption rates can be lower when you're eating products that are sitting next to, eating nutrients sitting alongside phytates, which bind and prevent absorption. So if we go through, choline, iodine, which, seaweeds. So as long as you're eating enough dulse flakes, nori flakes, or iodine, salt, things like that. B12, calcium, vitamin D.
So B12 is, there's no B12 in plants, so we have to make it out of plant matter into our microbiome. So again, a lot of that goes back to microbiome.
If you've got a good microbiome,
but that's an interesting one.
Right?
So B12 in ruminants is made in their small intestine. But in humans is made in our large intestine.
And we absorb it in the small intestine.
We might absorb a tiny bit, but it's too distal. Most of it is not absorbed at all, which is why vegans, no matter if you're not having, if B12, if you're not actually consuming food that has B12 in it, and reaching your small intestine, that they get low levels. Right. So you can eat as much plant food as you want as a vegan. And yes, your microbiome in your colon can produce B12. But it's being produced too distally in the colon, right? So they're not getting absorption. Maybe a tiny bit. There are certainly some people out there that will say they haven't had B12 for 20 years and they're okay. But the majority of studies show that B12 is a nutrient that vegans need to focus on from a supplement.
And it's interesting because I was hoping you weren't going to go towards the coprophagy and autophagy, which they talk about,
which is a good way of
recycling your B12. There's also
eating other people's poo. There's also want to mix things up a little bit.
The enterohepatic circulation does a little bit of redelivering it back through towards those absorption pathways. As a really good source is your own microvilli. As we shed our gut wall, we actually get a lot of nutrients out of that as well if you're deficient. But the B12 thing for me, I was really screwed my brain a little bit because of how it was so backwards, and I wasn't sure exactly the process of how it was happening. But a lot of those recycling of that through that enterohepatic circulation and then actually breaking down your own tissue to recycle it. It's only really small levels that we actually hold in our body, very small amounts we're constantly recycling. So it's an interesting one to see that it's commonly deficient, but I don't know how much we actually need. I don't know.
I think it's also like the case studies on people that have had severe deficiencies. It can have fairly significant negative, effects on your health from a nervous system point of view. So, perhaps there's a bit more hysteria around B12 than there needs to be.
Yeah, and the injections are weird.
The general advice is from physicians is to supplement with it.
Yeah.
And the other one that we missed there was iron, which is the largest nutrient deficiency across anyone.
Yep.
The Australian Dietary Guidelines recommend, if you are eating a vegetarian or vegan diet, to have 1.8 times the standard recommended daily intake of iron, because the absorption rate is lower.
Where do you get
away
your
from
iron
meals? Because of the phytates. So again, we're looking at, so for example, green tea even can inhibit the absorption of iron by up to about 20%.
Yeah.
Any of these high phytate sort of stuff can bind and reduce the absorption. So a lot of the problems there is when your iron is incorporated into a meal full of phytates and that sort of stuff, you're going to get less absorption until you're in that really deficient state, and then the active transport pumps and that sort of stuff pick up. What about enzymes? I mean, we talk a lot about these phytates and oxalates binding things, but I mean, there are enzymes such as phytase. Is that a popular thing within the... Do you recommend people use enzymes to help break down phytates and liberate the nutrients?
I mean, depending on if someone's having problems with their digestion. I don't personally take any digestive enzymes.
No.
I think some of the protein powders that I've had those incorporated in them before. But for me, I focus on just having that varied diet, and the iron. Going back just quickly to the iron one, I think it's 8 milligrams for a male. Around 8 milligrams in RDI or whatever, and you sort of were asking where I get that from. Legumes, some dark leafy greens. I get a lot of questions from people saying, well, if there's calcium and there's iron in the same food, is that inhibiting? Because calcium can inhibit iron absorption as well.
Zinc. Yeah.
And to simplify this for people, I say, if you're having an issue with iron, that's where you need to zoom in and go, okay, what's going to enhance my iron absorption and what's going to inhibit it, and I should try and separate things. But if you're not having an issue with your iron, you don't need to overcomplicate things. Eat that varied diet. Yes, there's going to be some phytates in your food, but I'm consuming well over 8 milligrams a day of iron, and it makes up for that. That you get a lower absorption rate. So naturally, if you're eating enough calories and it's a well-diversified plant-based diet, for the most part, most of those nutrients you will get, B12 aside. And then, certain people might have slightly lower absorptions, whatnot, due to their microbiome, and that's where you need to put more focus and dig a bit deeper into how you can increase your absorption, or do you need to supplement?
I had a mental blank before when I was in the middle of a sentence about B12, and I had a bit of a stare up. There's some new data out on B12 where they actually, in the early days, they didn't have the ability to identify the different forms of cobalamins. So when they went through and they used to talk about spirulina, for example, being a fantastic source of B12, the recent research have actually refined the ability to measure cobalamins and found there's some anti-nutrient forms of B12. So where we used to in the past tell people to have lots of spirulina and that sort of stuff to increase their B12, it's actually been determined that that can lower their B12. So some people...
it competes, like it looks like
it.
Same.
It utilises the absorption pathways, but it's not actually useful within the body and can actually compete. So there's other people out there too. We kind of see our B12 levels low, so we go over the top and over supplement with something like a spirulina. It might actually be doing more harm than good. And like we always said, it takes ages for the truth to come out compared to these bad stories. The wrong information is so easily accessible, and then the truth comes out a little bit later. It's so hard to go back and convince people.
We might be even seeing that about vitamin D at the moment, because it's a real buzz for people supplementing vitamin D.
It's weird too, vitamin D too, because I'm positive, and everyone, I think I'm losing my mind because no one agrees with me, but when I studied naturopath, in the early days, when they used to do vitamin D testing, I used to have to protect it from the UV light. They used to draw the blood, wrap it in alfoil, keep those little vials in alfoil so I couldn't see anything. As soon as it got exposure to light, it started degrading and everything like that. They don't do any of that now, and every person's vitamin D deficient. I'm not sure. There's something weird going on with vitamin D. It's probably just everyone on statin medication, but
exactly.
I can go. I've been tested, and my vitamin D, been told my vitamin D levels are low, and I've good. Plenty of sun and all that sort of stuff, and just didn't make sense. I think there's something weird going on there.
And back to B12, the other interesting thing is because you've got those sort of like active, inactive analogues that you're talking about, is the reliability of a serum B12 test is not that high.
Yeah, exactly.
Because it's hard to separate between those active and inactive analogues in your body.
Yeah.
So like you're saying, you could be having a lot of spirulina, but if you just run a serum B12 test that isn't differentiating, right, you might look like your B12's okay, or it might look really high.
Yep.
And a more accurate predictor is homocysteine or MMA.
I'm so glad you said that.
Which should, if they're elevated, you've probably got a deficiency in your B12.
Yep. And you can do your MMAs with your organic acid test too, the methylmalonic acid or whatever it is. And with those, same thing with the B12, sometimes, or the iron, people constantly be telling they got this iron problem because they're always coming up anemic. But we got iron, B12 and folate all together need to make hemoglobin.
Absolutely.
So they're told they got low hemoglobin, they just get told to go buy a dodgy iron, Another interesting thing could be when we mentioned earlier about the vitamin C and the proline, some of the signs to know if someone needs more vitamin C might be things like the inability to absorb iron or low iron levels, along with fatigue and malaise and the inability to regenerate the collagen and connective tissue. So for the people out there that are getting recurrent infections, their gums aren't really awesome, they got a lot of fatigue because you need vitamin C to make your stress chemicals, your catecholamines and that sort of stuff. So people are starting to see those signs. It might be an indication that they could increase their vitamin C levels and that sort of thing as well, because it's not always in there. It degrades quite quickly in the processed foods if it's in there at all, So they're
and particularly, I guess, if your diet's slanted towards a refined food diet as well, it's even worse.
And you mentioned before the TMAO, which is the choline and carnitine feeding bacteria that turn those really healthy things into atherogenic plaques. The way to know if that's you is you smell like fish. After you have the choline and carnitine, you get a funny odour through your body, like a very fishy odour. And that's actually the chemical that causes heart disease. So if you're one of those people that takes like a B-complex vitamin that's a high in choline and you end up smelling fishy, or you're taking your carnitine pre-workout and you smell fishy, there's a fair chance that you've got those bugs that are converting those healthy stuff into atherosclerotic plaque-forming chemicals. And the way to fix that is just with modbiotics or garlic and that sort of stuff, just changing over your gut. And that's one of the ways garlic is so good for heart disease and bloods, is actually controlling a microbiome's ability to convert that stuff into bad plaque. So that's interesting.
They've done some studies on choline and carnitine and looked at omnivores and vegans.
Yeah.
And have found that if you are eating a plant-based diet, you don't actually have those bacteria. At all. So if you were to supplement carnitine or choline,
fascinating.
You will not create any TMAO.
See, that's the sort of stuff I love to hear, because that starts to make some mechanism of actions of how the animal diet can contribute to heart disease. Because you can create a lot of data and scenario to say it doesn't. You can have a look at epidemiological studies to see that it does. As soon as you see this missing link in regards to the microbiome, I mean, there's 500 times the amount of genetic material in your gut that can change daily, compared to your genetic material within your body is not going to change that fast. So I think there's a big future looking at this gut microbiome with it.
It's
I
a big
can't wait
space
for
in the
more.
next 10 years.
Yeah.
And it's something that you're focusing on at the moment, isn't it? It's obviously looking at the different types of plants and the impact that it has on the gut. So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I guess from top level, I like to keep things fairly simple with people and talk about making sure that they're hitting their daily fibre targets.
Yep.
And within fibre, some fibre is prebiotic fibre, which you guys have obviously spoken a lot about, and there's different types of prebiotic fibres, but then also outside of prebiotic fibre, there's other prebiotics, resistant starch, phytochemicals and things like that your bacteria feed on. So prebiotic feeds your bacteria and leads to short chain fatty acids, and I'm telling you guys everything that you know. So
that's good.
In terms of what I tell people is, again, diversity is key.
Yes.
King. Like if you're not having a diverse diet, and I was running something recently called the Plant Proof 40 Challenge, where I was just encouraging people to make sure they're having 40 unique plants every week.
That's great.
And it sounds easy, but people were coming back and like, I thought this was easy, and then by day 2-3, I was like, wow, I'm only having 10 or 12 different plants a week.
And is this mainly vegans as well too? Or is this everyone?
Everyone, right?
Okay.
This is everyone, like all inclusive. So there's a number of people that are not vegan within my community that I speak with, and they're all getting around this challenge, and they're finding it really interesting, like to draw this connection between diversity and gut health.
Yep.
Yeah.
And they'll be forced to eat local and within seasons too, because to get that diversity.
That's it, because you're probably not going to find, I mean, again, that level of products. I mean, it's all, you know, the range that we get in the typical supermarkets, because it's manufactured in mass and it's packed in mass and it's shipped in mass, is that there's just not that level of diversity. I was thinking, and maybe it's a wrong conclusion, that, you know, the omnivores would probably have maybe half a dozen that they eat through the week, whereas the vegans and vegetarians might be double that, you know. But is that
it's probably a different starting point.
Sure.
It might be a little more achievable for vegans to hit the 40. It depends on who that omnivore is. I've got friends who are omnivores, but they're 85, 90% plant-based. So for them, you know, they're essentially plant-based, right?
Yeah.
So it depends how, you know, where you sit on that spectrum. But it also depends on your culture, how you're brought up. Was it the same 3 veg all the time, and you've done that your whole life, potato, carrots, or, you know, tomato, lettuce, whatever. Like, it makes a game of it, and I found that it starts to get people going into the grocery store, and like you said, I say buy things that are seasonal, you know, and when you're buying 40 things, you can go in there with no intention of what you're going to buy and just go and grab the ones that are on sale that you haven't had before. Bring them home and work out what to do with them.
Because we're all taught with that, through that food pyramid and everything, we're taught to eat a balanced diet, you know, the 5s and 2s and all these different things you hear on TV about how to balance out fruit and to remind us to eat our fruit and vegetables and our cereals. But we get into the habit of finding some of those things that we like, that we can afford, that are available, and we just get in this habit where we're a balanced diet but not a varied diet. And now we're learning all this stuff about this microbiome. And same with probiotics and prebiotics. Most of the probiotic supplements are the same. Most of the prebiotic supplements are the same. And a lot of people are eating the same food every day. So what's happening is people are building up certain strains, and that's where we lose the diversity. That's when we actually strengthen up certain colonies of bugs, because they get fed their favourite foods every day. And not their poisons, just their favourite foods. And then the other bugs just don't get a chance to thrive and survive without their favourite foods coming in regularly. I mean, we evolved with fruit seasons and then winter and all that sort of stuff, where things are supposed to change, where at the moment I got an acreage and we got the mulberry trees and we got all those different things, but they will only really fruit you eat only that for only a couple of weeks, and then it's gone. Then you move on to the next tree and that sort of stuff. So you
like
never build up enough. Actually, interesting, I get a lot of people coming at me about questions with immunoglobulin testing, and they're saying, oh, these things are scam because whatever I'm eating seems to show up. And I said, yeah, we use immunoglobulin testing to confirm the theory of eating with seasons. You eat the same thing every day, you're going to start reacting to it, your body's getting too much of it, you need to change. And when you change, those immunoglobulins drop, and then they build up to the next thing you're eating, and then it's time to change. So this cycling thing, how the hell do we get the point across to everyone that you've got to eat local? You've got to support your local farmers. It's a challenge when
it's sort of going against where our food system has gone, which provides things in abundance from around the world, and the food that you want is often always there, right?
Yeah.
So you don't have a real need to change. But I think it just comes down to education. And
see, we buy our groceries, we get some organic groceries delivered once a week from a particular farm, and we have no idea what's coming. So whatever, we just pay a certain amount, fill a box, whatever's perfect, whatever you're harvesting right now is what we're going to get. That's kind of the way I think we need to all start working with our locals.
Well, I guess it depends where you are, because I mean, you're from Bondi, but you also spent a bit of time in Byron as well too. Do you find that Byron's a good place to shop and get fresh local?
Yeah, you can get plenty of local stuff up
there. That's where mine comes from, actually.
Yeah. I'd imagine that would be a really good community. They seem to be quite health focused.
In Bondi, there's markets, there's local markets, and they usually have their signs up where they're from, and their food does change. You see that it changes.
Yeah.
So, I think that's a huge tip. If people can, and it's an affordable way to feed their family, to support local produce and to eat with the seasonality it's a great
and
tip.
Holistically, because what we've also found is, again, I keep talking about these processed and refined foods, but inside the heart of these foods is usually where we find the sugars, and on the outside we have a nice little evil case of poison to keep the bugs and everything out. So when we eat the whole food, excuse me, we get a bit of sugar and we get a bit of poison. So for every little bit of feeding and that we have something else coming in, keeping the population under control. So that is something that we've also lost. And then if you're going to add in more prebiotics and then more probiotics, you just overgrow and overgrow and overgrow. Now, those bugs, they want to protect their host, which is you, and they want to keep you the way you are. They don't want you to lose weight or change too much. So they will then regulate your metabolism and your cravings and keep you feeding them exactly what they want. So a lot of people have got to understand too that some of the cravings they might be getting, especially trying to switch from a meat diet over to a plant-based diet, or when they try to make significantly change it, sometimes we get cravings or our body feeling, oh, this doesn't feel quite right. For me, I feel lousy or whatever, going through a healing crisis. People got to understand that initially it's a lot of the changing in the bugs. We get a die-off, we get these things called Herxheimer reactions, and the bugs somehow screw with our brain and tell us to eat what they want to eat. I don't know how, they're sneaky little buggers, but they make you crave what they're craving, and they will try to tell you, no, that you need to go back and steal that milk from that baby animal, to tell you to crave your dairy and to go back and eat your meats, or your meal doesn't feel right without the meat. You're not getting the satiety. A lot of that's the bugs.
Absolutely,
and don't let them win.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I've heard numerous doctors talk about the fact, particularly with like carnitine, when you're transitioning away from a lot of animal products, you'll get a craving from your gut bacteria for carnitine.
Yeah.
Is that right?
So they'll make you crave those things, but the problem is that's only while that they'll change. They need to take a period of time, but we have to understand as well that gut bugs have evolved through seasons. So they can wait quite a while. Like if you just change their diet, they can lay dormant and then they shoot little eggs out and wait. And they can wait and survive up to about 9 months, because that's typically waiting for the next fruit season to come back, or for their season, whatever their food is, whether it's the hunting season or whatever, to come back. And if you keep avoiding it for long enough, they will change, and your body will change in relation to it. Or you can use it more of the modbiotics or more of those antimicrobial sort of poisons, which you're going to get from the outer leaves of your plants and the garlics and the onions, to change your microbiome and force it to change, which is another benefit of a whole holistic style plant diet rather than a highly processed and refined one. Because we're talking a lot about the actives that kill off these bugs are things like polyphenols, and they're yucky. They typically are astringent and they don't taste nice into your mouth. So when they highly process and refine a plant-based protein into a protein bar or something like that full of polyphenols, tastes bad, so they overload it with sugar again. And then those ratios keep the bugs out of whack. So my point is work local, work within the seasons, and work with holistic stuff, not overly refined, because this is where you can go to a vegan style diet to be healthy but end up worse, because you've found that, I can handle fried tofu and I can handle a couple of other plant-based, and I'm just going to base my whole diet on that. And that's when all of a sudden your plant-based vegan diet has made you less healthy.
Absolutely. I mean, I think regardless of your dietary framework, you need to have diversity in the plants and need seasonality.
Yeah, exactly.
I was going to ask you, Simon, I always we did one on Superfoods a while ago, like pomegranate is just an amazing fruit. Like, do you have any like staples that you consider a must-have through, like in terms of your favourite foods? And do you have anything that you use, if you're sick or not feeling well, that you sort of reach for as sort of like medicinal purposes?
So my girlfriend, her mum is from like a homeopathic style background, and they grew up vegetarian. My girlfriend's now vegan, but so she's very big on these sort of natural remedies.
Yep.
A lot of the time I'll leave them to her. But to be honest, let me first say, I don't think I've been sick for over 3 years. Not once. Not one cold, not one runny nose.
Yeah, right.
That's awesome.
So sort of can't really draw on much experience from that angle. But in terms of other superfoods, I have various superfoods in, like if I make smoothies and things, like beetroot powders and maca powders and things like that, but tend not to go over the top. I think early on I had not an addiction, but I was like, more is better. Everything. And I was probably focusing a lot more on that than on the actual whole foods and seasonality and diversity. So I mean, I'm loving beetroot powder at the moment, which is
for performance, like for the nitrates.
I'm finding that I feel better working out. Still trying to work through the research and work out how much of that is in my mind versus true performance. So
A lot of it's mucosa, though. Did you see the studies in the beetroot studies where they stopped beetroot working with an antimicrobial mouthwash? So they gave these people beetroot juice, and it had the vasodilation effect through the nitric oxide, which was really weird because it was state-dependent vasodilation, meaning that somehow a signal from the body suggested we had not enough oxygen. A message went to the mucosa. The bacteria in the mucosa liberates the nitrates to nitrites to make nitric oxide for vasodilation. And it all hinged around bacteria, specifically oral bacteria, that actually would convert it. And then they actually did a second arm of the study where they gave people the beetroot juice and then an antibacterial mouthwash, and it totally stopped it from working.
There you go.
Yeah, so a lot of that, it's crazy how these bugs are insane.
It reminds me actually a little bit of the infrared when we brought that out, and we're originally going, oh, this is fantastic, this is really good for any athletes, including vegan, and they're like, hang on a minute, we can't do that because it used to have honey in it.
Yeah.
Oh, I was going to ask you, do you miss honey? Like, is that something that you...
I wasn't a big honey. I was a very big maple syrup
fan.
What, are you not allowed maple syrup?
No, so I do. So
as
in, for vegans who love honey, a lot of them, some probably still have it, but other ones would swap to maple syrup. For me, I was already having maple syrup, it was kind of easy there. But I had something to say around the bacteria in the mouth. That I've been thinking a lot lately, sort of around, things like green smoothies versus chewing your food again, and the impact that bacteria in your mouth has. So that's another thing I've been trying to incorporate is if I'm having dark leafy greens, not always in a smoothie. And sometimes I only part blend them. Sounds gross, but then so you still have to chew them down. A little bit of an aspect.
It's really important. It's really important too because of the things like Akkermansias and that sort of stuff. Where you need to build them up in your mouth. They really regulate your metabolism and that sort of stuff. And Akkermansia is a cool bug for the mouth. It really does stimulate metabolism. Its favourite food's carbon. So having those fasted cardios and that sort of stuff, and doing those. Getting that heavy panting and that sort of stuff builds up Akkermansia and improves your sporting performance, and that will also does a major effect with the liberation of the nitrates and that sort of stuff for vasodilation. Again, showing how going for a morning walk on an empty stomach can actually change the microbiome, that can change your whole cardiovascular system and how it responds to foods. It's really fascinating. I reckon there's so much with these bugs, and I think that I really look. You've inspired me a little bit with one thing you said about that. What's changed when we eliminate the meats? Because when that group you were talking about before, where everything was pretty well the same except one group just took out the meat, was really interesting because something's changed in that. And I'd love to see if they've done any microbiome studies on that.
I mean, the microbiome, there's lots of studies showing plant-based populations have different microbiome.
Oh, yeah.
And even comparing kids in Africa to kids in Europe who have completely different diets to kids in Africa, mainly plant-based, just due to their access to food. Completely different microbiomes.
And that fibre, you said before that without the juicing, people that take the fibre out, you should try to work out a way of putting a lot of that back in, but you still need to chew the bloody thing. And a lot of our doses, sometimes in the naturopathic world, we're always looking at what's a reasonable dose or what's the ideal dose. And we've got to mouth a certain size, we've got to chewing, it takes a certain amount of energy in throats and stomachs. So it's a good way when you're eating things naturally, how much are you capable of eating? Like really, that's a good way of regulating your dose and making sure you're not overdosing. But you need that total process through there because it signals all the other next stages of your digestive process, and all of that involves the microbiome.
I mean, did you guys see there was a study in the Lancet journal, I think it was late last year, on dietary fibre. So they did a systematic review of meta-analyses and looked at dietary fibre intake with health outcomes, both morbidity and mortality. People that were hitting at least 24 to 29 grams of dietary fibre were significantly less chance of developing cancer, type 2 diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease. They had less overall total risk of total mortality. And then it said, like in the paper, that even beyond the 24 to 29, they expected even greater benefits. So I think, like, rounding out this whole conversation around fibre, for most people, because it can be quite complex, right? Talking about all these little intricacies, is just eat more of it.
Yeah. And don't throw it away. The other issues that I always notice too with the juicing is, things like kale juice. So we get these glucosinolates and everything. So glucosinolates that have got anti-cancer properties and that estrogen detoxification. But part of them is these things called isothiocyanates, which are toxic compounds to the thyroid. The only way you can possibly get an adequate dose of these toxic isothiocyanates is kale juice. So raw kale juice, everything else kind of processes it, slows it down. It's the only way you can actually get a massive dose of that to actually slow down your thyroid. So that's why I tell a lot of people to eat these things, because the process of chewing the kale and getting those fibers, it controls the dose and you won't overdose and slow down your thyroid.
You're talking to a girl overseas, I won't mention her name because I wouldn't want to embarrass her, but a household name, who was drinking this kale juice, but she was getting all these
thyroid issues.
Yeah.
And then that makes sense. And I mean, like, juicing's becoming a massive thing, but it to your point, it's eliminating all of the benefits of chewing your food and the interaction with the bacteria in your mouth.
Yeah, and a lot of those polyphenols and that stuff that's missing, if you go and eat it, it's not just plain fibre. You can taste the astringency, you can taste the tannins, a lot of the polyphenols that are in amongst that fibre. So you're losing all of that ability, but what you're getting extra of is the sugar. So you're getting the sugars out of the plants and you're getting certain nutrients in concentration, yes, but the imbalance between the sugar, the fibre and the modbiotic polyphenol compounds, I think that's one of the biggest changes that's happened globally with our food. So if we have a look at the changes within our food, it's ample data to show, the sugar in our diets or whatever have gone up.
Like
the fiber's gone down.
Free added sugars?
Yeah, but also fiber's dropped down so much. So our food's changed so much. We've got all the thin skins, we've got the seedless everything, and we're losing the fiber. And within that fiber, we're losing the polyphenols and the modbiotics. So they're in amongst that fiber usually, in the skins and in the seeds and that.
And I mean, like they've run studies where they look at, this is like looking more at the effect of sugar.
Yep.
But looking at the insulin response and how insulin sensitive or resistant someone is with fruit. So they've got table sugar.
Yep.
Or 100% glucose, whatever it is, and measured the response in the blood spike. Then they get a group where they have blackberries or blueberries.
Yep.
Right, and eat the equivalent amount of sugar.
Yep.
So whatever they were given in the table sugar, the same amount of sugar that's inside those blueberries. Measure the spike.
Yep.
And I think, as most people listening would expect, the spike is far different when you eat that sugar, when it's with the phytochemicals, with the dietary fiber, everything else. But the really interesting thing is then they ran the study again, and they said, okay, what about a third group who has the same amount of sugar plus the blueberries?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And their response was even lower than just having the blueberries.
You serious?
What?
So there seems to be a real protective effect almost there. So
and I could hypothesize part of it because they've noticed a similar thing by spiking. There was a similar study with I think it was a rice syrup. And it's something at high fructose thing that triggered a significant insulin trigger from the tongue. So the sweetness on the tongue set up the body to prepare for the sugars that are coming. And so if you get the sweetness of the unrefined sugars, you'll get that little insulin spike. And then when the sugars are coming through from the fruit and vegetable, you've had an amplified insulin response, which caused a reduction in the blood sugar, so that you get the double whammy. You can actually basically saying it with the sweetness, you can prime the body to prepare for the fruit sugars that are due to come.
Okay.
But there's also big difference between high fructose corn syrup and fructose.
Yeah.
I got a feeling there's a lot of people out there that have put fructose in the basket of bad stuff because of the high fructose corn syrup.
I mean, sugar is such it's an umbrella term.
Yeah.
The way that refined free added sugars affect your body compared to the sugars in fruit is completely different. And in fact, if you look at like the Rotterdam study, which is a huge study that classifies people based on how much plants they eat, from basically an all meat diet to an all plant based diet. Again, people that are consuming the most amounts of fruit have the least chance of developing type 2 diabetes. So like type 2 diabetes is certainly not.
So we can say fruit's healthy.
However, I can say that I sort of understand if doctors, and I believe all doctors have the best intentions, but if doctors don't fully understand the mechanism, say, of insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes, they can tell their patients don't eat fruit because there's fructose in it. But the fruit's not the problem. The problem is that they can't get that glucose into the cell because they've got insulin resistance.
Yes,
and
yeah.
we're managing, the symptom and the current rather than treating the disease.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Sugar's in the wrong spot.
So before we go out for a vegan lunch with you, so we'll go with Simon, maybe to St. Coco's or something, and go and have something.
Here we go.
Nice to eat there. Well, I can't eat meat now. I mean, I just feel like an absolute heretic.
No. That's certainly not the point of today's discussion.
But I mean, outside of you spending time with Chris and Liam Hemsworth, and doing your podcast, which is absolutely killing it as well too, and getting hit up by Penguin Books to write books, you're a busy man. So I mean, in terms of what's next for you? I mean, we mentioned off air about Penguin Books. I mean, so you've been approached to obviously write a book for those guys.
Yeah, they one of the lovely editors down there at Sydney, at the Sydney office, Penguin Random House, who are a pretty big publisher. They contacted me late last year.
Yeah.
Felt that I could put something into a book that maybe people would like.
Yeah.
So I went along and had a meeting and signed a book deal, which means the book will be available early 2020.
That's so cool.
Great.
And
Can you say much about the topic? Or?
I decided that I'll donate 100% of my profits to charities.
Wow,
Which
is
is
great.
based upon a large part of my message is that I'm dissecting science and putting the science out around veganism that isn't attached to an ethic or sustainability point of view, and I don't have an agenda.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I don't want to be seen as selling a book for profit. I am genuinely putting information in there which I think will not that I think, I know will benefit people's health.
Perfect.
And the book's not a militant vegan book. It's more about adopting a predominantly or fully plant-based diet, whatever end of the spectrum you want to go. So that's probably been my greatest challenge to date, writing that book. Trying to get everything out of my mind into a way which is understandable to people who don't have the time to go through the science, because the science, you can go down all sorts of rabbit holes.
And you can't do you can never write a book saying the science is settled and that sort of stuff anyway. Yeah. So it's like, as we know of at this point in time, this is what we understand. Yeah, because if you wrote a book 20 years ago and talked about vegan B12, the data would be so different to what we're coming out with now.
500 years ago, Galileo wrote a book saying, the Earth is, it's not, and then what happened to him, not the centre of the universe, and what happened to him.
You mentioned that study before. One of my favourite authors and one of my naturopathic heroes, an old bloke called Bernard Jensen. But he used to do the same thing. He'd travel around the world and just look for communities that lived a healthy, happy lifestyle. And he'd just live with them for a period of time and document what they did. And he'd know the same sort of stuff we're talking about. So some things, if you don't try to be too clever and too detailed, the patterns and the concepts we can understand and teach.
Our intellect and curiosity gets us to zoom right in, right? And we love reductionist science, and it is interesting in understanding mechanisms, but there's a lot to be learned and said just by looking at people who are doing it well.
That's really true. And actually, to mention your podcast as well, Plant Proof Podcast as well, you do a lot of interviews with different people as well too. So I've got a list of some of the people here. You did mental health with Sam Webb, around suicide prevention, clinical use of plant-based diets with Dr. Padma Garvey, is that how you pronounce that? Yep. Jermaine Jones, vegan athlete and professional USA soccer player. I love any athletes around football, because that's my favourite thing, right?
Yeah,
so,
he's a cool guy.
Who does he play for?
He was part of the American Olympic soccer team.
Oh, wow.
He's retired now.
Okay.
He just retired.
Yeah.
And before that, he was playing for Germany.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Oh, wow. So right at the top of his game.
Yeah, he was
and
he actually scored a goal in the US Olympics. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
But don't quote me on that. It might have been the World Cup. I probably should remember.
So
one or the other.
But no, in terms of so you just reach out to these people and say, hey, this is a topic. Would you like to come on the podcast? I mean, and how do you determine what topic you're going to talk about? Is it just purely interest, or
a great community who put forward people and create introductions. So a lot of the guests that are on there, I've got to thank my community for that, for setting those up. Other ones are just a bit of a snowball. So you do an interview with a doctor, and then they have contacts with other doctors, and maybe they know that I'm going to be in LA or in New York, and then we catch up and work out if there's a topic that we think will add value
Yep.
to the
Yeah.
listener. But I've had other athletes on there, like Rich Roll, who's a ultra endurance athlete.
I've heard a fair
I've heard
bit
of him.
about him lately.
Yeah, so-
Actually, I was only in America last week and people were telling me.
He's written a book called Finding Ultra.
Yeah.
He's got a really cool story. So I had him on the show, and some bodybuilders, and yeah.
Because it's really cool, the sort of information you get from people that are trying to do a little bit more than just the average person. You know, because a lot of other people say, oh, you know, I feel okay, but I'm not trying to do anything. So when you see people trying to go a little bit above and beyond and then using that plant-based diet, you can get... It'll either make it or break it. So you can really learn a lot from those people that are pushing a body to the limits.
Epic 5, which is, and again, don't quote me on this, but I think it's an Ironman, 5 days in a row, each Hawaiian island, day after day after day after day.
Wow,
after
that's
day.
crazy.
Yeah. So he's like a proper endurance athlete.
Yeah.
And he talks about when he went through his transition that he just felt like he could run for days.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah.
Is that right? And so this is all, they can search this up on iTunes because you've got all
Yeah,
the...
everything is on, the podcast is on iTunes, it's on Google Podcasts, Spotify, all that sort of
And
stuff.
your website as well too?
And yeah, plantproof.com, and I usually post the creators for the episodes on Instagram, plant_proof.
Excellent. And so anything else that we haven't covered that you're doing at the moment that you sort of want to sort of bring attention to?
Wow. God, I'm doing a lot of writing right now, which is taking up the majority.
I'm so jealous,
the majority of my time. Which it's kind of, it is a challenge, but it's nice.
So how do you do that? So you get up in the morning and you just you do your exercise and your meals, and then
got to get into the
with your
right mind frame. So like
and-
getting, if you know, having a workout, a sweat, having like good food in the system will allow for a flow, you know, get into that flow state, I guess.
Do you do it
with the
outside?
writing.
Do you go down like the beach and
Yeah,
do
I
it,
try
or
and
in
mix
your
it.
office?
Particularly if I know that I need to do like a 5 or 6 hour stint of writing, which is a fair bit when yours is like zoned in on writing. I try and change that environment.
Yeah.
And you're also writing for the reader as well too.
Yeah.
You know? So bodybuilding.com, Sydney Morning Herald, Men's Health Magazine, and Nourish Magazine as well too. So like, is it a regular contribution?
Yeah. So
to those?
Nourish, I've got a collaboration with them. So they're a great plant-based magazine in Australia. So I do a lot of writing for them, and you know, they usually feature like sort of 3 or 4 pages of my writing every month in their magazine, which is amazing.
Yeah,
that's excellent.
That's great.
So I just write on, you know, different topics, whether it's helping people transition or dealing with more fibre, a lot of the stuff we've spoken about today.
Yeah. And the topics, so people come with you with a lot of questions as well, and that might inspire a few of the topics.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah,
so like
you see trends. Hey,
everything in there is trying to be really practical. The key is to be able to keep stepping back into their shoes of someone who is looking at this information for the first time.
Yeah.
That's great.
Cool, man.
Excellent.
I love it.
So
It's really awesome.
I'm going to give you the final word. Is there anything else you want to say?
I think anyone listening who may be interested in a plant-based diet and has found today some of what I've said inspiring, just to not be turned off by any preconceived ideas of veganism, and just to see the benefits, you know, in the science for what they are in terms of making a shift towards eating more plants and reducing your animal consumption. And, you know, to what extent you do that is completely personal and up to your own unique circumstances. But if you do start to make some changes, you will feel benefits immediately, and you'll also be, you know, according to the science, reducing your chances of developing several diseases and hopefully living a longer, happier, high quality of life, which is really what it's all about.
Yeah, exactly. That's the goal.
And so jump onto the Plant Power website and have a look at Plant Proof. What am I saying? The Plant Proof, not Plant Power, plantproof.com to have a look. Obviously, more information there. And obviously, the thing that struck me is that that you said with Liam as well too, Hemsworth. I saw him in a new movie with the Australian girl Rebel Wilson. Have you seen that one yet?
I haven't seen it, no.
He looks amazing. Like, he comes out wearing basically a towel, and the guy's absolutely shredded and buffed and looking really good. So he's obviously been following that lifestyle for a fair while now.
Yeah, he's been doing it for a while. But I mean, one thing I can say about those guys, particularly Chris, is they know how to train.
Yeah.
You know, and they're consistent. And then a lot of the times, even with myself, people ask about results. I think regardless of your diet, you need, in diet as well.
Yeah.
It's about consistency. You know, implement some healthy changes, whether it's for your workout or your food, and be consistent. And those guys are great at that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, perfect. All right.
That's cool.
Well, that's it from me.
Thanks, boys.
That was
Yeah,
fun.
yeah.
Hey. Oh,
Yeah.
I mean, I could just talk for hours.
Yeah,
No, we better
thanks.
stop.
Thanks,
No,
Simon.
talk
Yeah.
more.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thanks
thanks
for
for coming
coming.
up. Appreciate it. Let's go to lunch.
I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Me too.